This is the last of the foundation chapters before we start covering the various disorders. In this chapter, we're going to cover the process of classifying people on the basis of symptoms, the diagnostic system, or DSM, and the various forms of psychological assessment that are used in the process of diagnosing. We'll cover a bit of the history of the classification system, which at this point goes back almost 70 years. We'll also talk about the process as it is conducted now and some of the tools that are used to make diagnoses. What is the purpose of giving a diagnosis to an individual? Well, first of all, a diagnosis reflects a pattern of symptoms, which we call a syndrome. And presumably this pattern of symptoms, the syndrome, represents a real underlying condition. To the extent that that assumption is true, our diagnosis may well lead to more effective, more reliably effective treatment and perhaps even prevention of some disorders. The process of classifying disorders has been around quite a while. In 1949, for example, the ICD version 6 was available. ICD stands for International Classification of Diseases. And in fact, that manual, which covers psychiatric disorders as well as physical disorders, is updated every few years. I believe the current ICD is version 13. The DSM, which is published by the American Psychiatric Association, covers only psychiatric disorders, and DSM-I and II were introduced in 1952 and 1968, respectively. I'm not sure of the exact reason why the American Psychiatric Association felt the need to break away from the ICD classification and do their own classification. What I do know, however, is that both DSM-I and DSM-II were heavily influenced by Freudian thought. And in fact, they made their diagnosis not on the basis of specific symptoms, but more importantly on the basis of inferred psychological events inside of the individual. Since we can't see inside of the individual, it was very difficult to get interrater reliability, so DSM-I and DSM-II were not very useful. Also, I want to talk a bit about some of the controversies. At one time, for example, homosexuality was considered a psychiatric disorder. And if you look at the history of that, you will see that the American Psychiatric Association dropped homosexuality from the DSM by a voice vote, not by data, but by a voice vote, and then reinstated it later also by a voice vote. This isn't how classification should be done. It should be based on objective data. Of course, now we recognize that homosexuality is not a psychiatric disorder and is not included in the DSM. There's always been some question about classification systems, and by that I mean all classification systems. The DSM is no different than other classification systems. Putting people into boxes, whether they be diagnostic or other categorization, is always an issue. The question is it worth it? And are there biases associated with it? Probably one of the most quoted studies in the field of psychiatry was done by Rosenhan, who sent colleagues, mostly graduate students, into psychiatric hospitals. And what these pseudopatients were to do was to say that they were experiencing symptoms. but in this case only a single symptom. They were hearing voices that said thud, hollow, and thump. Now that's not sufficient information based on the diagnostic manual for the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now remember, this was DSM-II, and DSM-II didn't have very good reliability. But what Rosenhan found is that virtually everyone got a diagnosis of schizophrenia on the basis of this limited symptomatology. Then what the patients or pseudopatients did is they stayed in the hospital until they were released. And like anthropologists, they simply observed what was going on. They were struck by the fact that the doctors didn't seem to notice that they weren't real patients, but the patients did. And the patients often would say, "You don't belong here." In contrast, the doctors treated them just as if they were patients. Now, this was a controversial study, and one of the things that Rosenhan did later is talk to the hospitals and said, "I'm going to do a second study, and I'm going to send people again to see if you can tell the difference between someone who is psychotic and someone who is not psychotic." Now, he actually didn't send any patients, but the hospitals detected several people that were seeking hospitalization were not actually psychotic. What Rosenhan concluded from this is that psychiatrists and psychologists are simply unable to tell the difference between psychotic and not psychotic. The Rosenhan study, which was published in Science, got a tremendous amount of play in the literature and among people who were not in the psychiatric field. Most people thought that his interpretations were indeed accurate, that you couldn't tell the difference between people who were psychotic and people who were not psychotic, and therefore the whole diagnostic system was in doubt. In 1975, a special issue of the Journal of Abnormal Psychology published several papers challenging the ideas that Rosenhan had presented, and did it with data that, frankly, in my opinion, are much stronger than Rosenhan's. For example, Rosenhan said all of his people behaved entirely normally, and therefore they should have been easily recognized as not being psychotic. But as one author in this special issue pointed out, what they did is they went to the hospital. Simply going to the hospital indicates that you are feeling distress. They presented the symptoms, the doctors accepted it, and they admitted them to the hospital for observation and possible treatment. But behaving normally would mean, okay, I proved my point. You can't tell the difference between someone who's psychotic and not because you admitted me and I'm not psychotic, so I will go to you and tell you that I'm a graduate student who was sent here to see whether I would be admitted to the hospital. But none of them did that. All of them continued to stay in the hospital and do whatever was asked of them in the hospital. Secondly, one of the things that Rosenhan emphasized is that even at the release of the patients, they were still considered to be psychotic because the release diagnosis in every single case was schizophrenia, in remission. So they're still schizophrenic. The symptoms aren't there at that time, or at least they're mild. Now, what Rosenhan didn't realize, because frankly he didn't know anything about psychiatry and psychiatric diagnosis, is that it is almost unheard of for someone with the diagnosis of schizophrenia to ever have the phrase "in remission" in the diagnosis. Less than 1 in 10,000 people with the diagnosis of schizophrenia will ever have "in remission." But every single one every single one of the patients, pseudopatients that Rosenhan sent to the hospital were released with that diagnosis. In other words, the evidence that Rosenhan said proves that people can't tell the difference between psychotic and not psychotic is thoroughly disproved by his own data. Where the DSM-I and DSM-II were not very good because you couldn't get interrater reliability, DSM-III changed all of that. Several things happened with DSM-III. First of all, the diagnostic manual went from roughly 50 pages to several hundred pages. Many other diagnoses were added. A lot more information based on research was presented in the DSM-III. Also, the DSM-III included objective, observable symptoms as the basis for the diagnosis. As a consequence, the interrater reliability, the ability of two well-trained professionals to agree on what it was that the patient had, improved rather dramatically. And it made it possible for us to do much better research on these disorders. Finally, DSM-III introduced something entirely new called multi-axial diagnoses. Instead of just giving a single diagnostic code for the individual, we would give several pieces of information on different axes to give a better picture. By the way, there was one other thing that changed with DSM-III. In DSM-I and DSM-II, the rule was you could only have a single disorder, and that disorder must account for all of the symptoms that you saw. Now, besides the fact that that is completely illogical, it basically tied the hands of the diagnostic individuals. Why is it illogical? Think of it this way. Is it possible for someone to have cancer and a broken leg? There is no reason to suppose that only one condition accounts for all of the symptoms that one has, whether they be physical or psychological. DSM-III allowed us on axis 1 to give multiple diagnoses. So you might have, for example, someone who is depressed and is also abusing alcohol. Two separate disorders. Okay, what were those multi-axial dimensions? Axis 1 is where we put the clinical disorders themselves, like depression and substance abuse. Axis 2 were similar disorders that were more chronic and were a part of the individual, like personality disorders and also mental retardation. We, by the way, now call mental retardation intellectual dysfunction. Axis 3 is where you put medical conditions that might be affecting the individual. So, for example, if the individual was fighting cancer, that's certainly part of the picture of that individual and the situation the person was in. Axis 4 measured the stress levels and the processes that are creating stress for the individual, and axis 5 was a single score that indicated the level of functioning. So with information on all 5 axes, you had a much better picture of what the individual was like. Since this dramatic change in the DSM, starting with DSM-III, there have been 4 revisions. A DSM-III revised, a DSM-IV and DSM-IV text revision, and more recently the DSM-V. The 3 revisions between DSM-III and DSM-V were gradual improvements based on research that was done largely because having objective criteria, which allowed us to more reliably diagnose disorders, allowed for better studies of the disorders and therefore gradual improvements in the diagnostic criteria used to define a disorder. DSM-V was a little different in some interesting ways. The first and major difference is that DSM-V dropped the multi-axial diagnoses. But I'm guessing it was a split decision by the committee responsible for putting together that portion of the DSM. The DSM is put together by committees of experts in each of the areas. Because if you look at the statement about the multi-axial diagnosis, it says we will no longer be using that in DSM-V. But in the next paragraph, it says, but we encourage you to do it. So there must have been some people who thought it was a good idea and others thought it had outlived its usefulness. There were not a lot of additions of disorders in DSM-V, but there was shifting of them into slightly different categories, again, based on research that had been done. There was a movement in several places to recognize that some of the disorders might not be categorical, what we've called taxonic, but rather dimensional. Now, that movement was not dramatic and it only affected some categories, but there was definitely a movement in that disorder. And there were some suggested new diagnoses. Now, these were not part of the diagnostic manual, but rather included to encourage researchers to do more study to see whether they belonged in the diagnostic manual. One of the issues that you need to think about when you think about any diagnostic system is the concepts of reliability and validity. You can have reliable diagnostic systems that are not valid, but you cannot have valid systems unless they are first reliable. Now, earlier I had told you that reliability refers to consistency and validity refers to accuracy. So how do you understand that you can have reliable measures that are not valid, but you can't have valid measures that are not reliable? Let me give you an example that's a little silly, but because it's silly, it's going to be easy for you to remember. We all know what intelligence is, and you're probably aware that we measure intelligence with specific tests called IQ tests. But they take a while, about 90 minutes to administer and maybe another 30 to 60 minutes to score. I'm going to create a new test that measures intelligence by measuring the size of a person's neck and multiplying it by a constant to get an IQ. Now, is that reliable? You might be surprised to learn that it is, because reliability is consistency. If I measure my own neck and someone else measures my neck, they should get the same number. And if I measure my neck today and I measure my neck a week from now, I will get roughly the same number. So I've got interrater reliability and I have test-retest reliability. And if I use many different measures, as long as they are accurate measures to measure the size of the neck, I will get the same number. So we have internal consistency reliability. But is it valid? Remember, validity means accuracy. Does the size of my neck indicate that I'm smart or not smart? Well, I've never done the study, and I have no intention of doing the study because I'm pretty sure the answer is no. So it's not worth my effort. So you can have a reliable measure that's not valid. Why is it that it has to be reliable before you can have valid? Well, if two people can't agree on what the score is, they can't agree on what it predicts, and therefore nothing can be predicted. You need reliability initially, but That does not guarantee validity. That has to be assessed separately. Now that we've talked about reliability, you can better understand why DSM-I and DSM-II had such terrible validity. The problem was they had virtually no reliability, and so validity was impossible. DSM-III dramatically improved reliability by focusing on things that people could objectively observe. It also improved validity, but it was only the start. By improving reliability from DSM-III to DSM-III-R to DSM-IV and DSM-IV-TR, we gradually were able to, through research, improve the validity of the diagnostic system. We've talked about the various types of reliability. There are also various types of validity. The ideal concept of validity is to have some godlike knowledge of the truth of the circumstance. So if we knew in some magical way who had a disorder such as schizophrenia, and then we saw how well our diagnostic system identified those people, but only those people, that would be the perfect test of validity. But we don't have those things. So we test validity by seeing what our concepts should predict. So for example, if the diagnosis of schizophrenia is a valid concept, what it means is that people who have that diagnosis should have a similar history and a similar course and should show similar symptoms and disabilities and should show a similar response to various treatments. Those are all ways in which we independently validate a disorder. Let's take something that you probably have a bit more familiarity with, and that's intelligence. What is the concept of intelligence? People that are more intelligent through some process that we're not specifying are able to learn more quickly and tend to learn better, which means that they should do better in school because school involves learning. Okay, that's a testable hypothesis. So, does our measure of intelligence predict how well people will do in school? That's how we validate an intelligence measure. But there are other things that intelligence should predict, and each of those represent various ways that we can validate them. Typically, we make the distinction between concurrent and predictive validity. So for example, if I give an IQ test and look at grade point average, that'd be concurrent validity because I'm measuring both of them at the same time. If I give an IQ test and I look at grades a year later, we're talking about predictive validity because the predictor, the IQ test, is given before we gather the criterion measure. Now that's a somewhat arbitrary distinction, but it helps us to understand the various ways that we validate a test. We also talk about convergent and convergent and divergent or discriminant validity. Convergent validity means that the information is converging on a single interpretation. So for example, if several different measures of intelligence all give us roughly the same predictions, that's converging evidence. If we find, for example, that IQ predicts some things but clearly does not predict other things, that's divergent or discriminant validity. We validate measures, such as a diagnosis, through these processes. Validation is never complete because it's always possible that later data will show us that our ideas were wrong and we have to modify them. That's a normal process in psychology. It's a normal process in the field of psychopathology.